In the world of video rentals, sex and violence often sells, and there's now concern that videos may be selling your child a violently distorted future. Movies depicting realistic murders are among the hottest draws for teenagers. And tonight, in part one of our special series, Channel 3's Don Hammond tells us why the scare goes beyond what we see on the TV.
There's this one guy who's sitting on a mattress and he's ripping himself apart with a razor.
Usually there's one person that's killing and they always kill the
gore. Oh, there's naked women all over the place.
They like to actually show the brains hanging on the floor.
They get chopped with axes and stuff.
And I like people getting cut up. I get into it.
At first you go, ah, but then after you see it and you like it, you start to like it.
And what they like are the bloodiest, most explicit and violent movies that have come out in the history of filmmaking. Many combine sex with violence, often depicting mutilation, rape, and murder. But they aren't seeing these movies at the theater. They're renting them from the horror section of your local video store.
The violence that is in there is things being done to women and on women. They're being hung up, they're being dismembered, they're being cut with surgicals, they're being shot in the face, point blank with a gun. And all of this type of stuff is being presented as acceptable.
With repeated exposure to the slasher films, I think what we're seeing is a callousness, a kind of desensitization to female victims of violence in particular.
Give it to her, you know, and slap her, shoot her, kill her, tear her apart.
They know it's entertainment, they know it's special effects, they get together, they have little parties, they watch these movies, they have a good time. I don't think they're really seeing the undercurrents that a lot of paranoid parents are seeing.
Chaz Ballin has talked to hundreds of teenagers about horror films. He's written books on the subject and serves as the splatter critic for 2 horror magazines.
I don't think they have to show the naked girl, but they do. They put sex and violence together a lot.
But it's cool. it's fun. It's crazy.
It's maybe their first exposure to sex. It is a slasher film in which sex is paired with the most gruesome and graphic forms of violence, so that the one begins to evoke the other in the young child's mind. That's a cause for concern.
Strong concern for Dan Lenz, who's a noted authority on the effects of sex and violence in the mass media. As a psychologist and professor at UC Santa Barbara, Lenz has conducted studies which expose male college students to slams, movies that depict women being brutalized in the worst ways, movies that are the most popular with kids today.
People that originally perceived a lot of violence in the material see less violence with repeated exposure. The material that was originally deemed to be offensive, degrading to women, less so with repeated exposure. But even more importantly, when we put them in a new situation now, when they're asked to make an evaluation of, let's say, a rape victim at trial, and we actually show people videotape reenactments of a trial, have them evaluate the victim, we find that she is judged as less injured, a little less sympathy for her, if the young men have been exposed to slasher films.
The movie that you can barely make out behind me, not a slasher film. However, it is so violent and graphic that we just can't show it on TV. It's also one of 2 movies chosen by a group of very nice teenagers who allowed us to come watch them watch movies. Here's how they reacted to Hellraiser 2.
Oh, that was bad.
Throughout this movie, they'll see faces ripped apart with hooks, a man slashing himself into a bloody pulp, and graphic, macabre tortures that defy description. But as the movie wears on, the shock value wears off. They've become desensitized to the violence, and though the movie still evokes grimaces, the movie no longer seems quite so grim.
They're seeing it as entertainment, and I don't think they're being sexually twisted or particularly malevolent or particularly misogynistic from watching these films. They can separate the fact from the fiction.
The real question is, are we as a society to conduct the social experiment, whereby we allow child after child after child to be exposed to these kinds of depictions, waiting to see if there is the kind of callousness that I'm talking about, or are we willing at this point to take a step to intervene?
In Sacramento, Don Hammond, Channel 3 reports.
If these tapes are so violent and so explicit, why is it so easy for teenagers to get a hold of them? Well, we'll have some answers to that question in part 2 of our special series, Violent Tapes, when Channel 3 reports tonight.
Just about anyone can rent a video movie. It happens all the time. But what if your child brought home an explicitly violent movie? Even though he may only have that tape for one night, the repeated effects of viewing material like that could last him a lifetime. Tonight, Channel 3's Don Hammond explains why it's so easy for our kids to get their something that could end up seriously hurting them.
By the time your child is 16, he will have witnessed about 2,000 acts of violence. And from those acts he sees on TV and the movies, 33,000 will be murders.
All this hellish, unhealthy, violent activity, our kids are seeing this and thinking it's normal.
We're talking about entertainment and movies, and it's not real.
But the fear that many groups now feel about what kids have access to at your local video store is real. They're called movies, and their main feature is murder. The films show graphic portrayals of mutilation, rape, and torture. Many combine female nudity with macabre butchery.
There is scene after scene in which the viewer is sort of lulled into a sexually erotic scene, and then immediately the psychotic killer enters and, you know, stabs the woman with a pitchfork or guts her with a machete or whatever.
Violent movies bring in big bucks from the 11 to 15-year-old set. It's an age group that can't get into the theater to see the R-rated films without someone over 18. But video stores don't fall under the same guidelines as movie theaters. Some stores have their own rating system, but at most, kids can rent anything.
The fighting, the so-called killings, the slice and dice. I mean, the entertainment value of the movie. They want to see a monster go chomp off someone's head. They have to in order to bring in the younger audience. So they throw all that stuff in there just to bring them in.
Dan Briggs manages Sacramento Video in South Sacramento. He says most video stores will oblige parents who don't want their kids renting violent movies.
Our members' cards, and we type on the back, do not rent any R-rated movies.
But typically, parents don't make that request, and even if they do, kids still get their hands on slasher movies. Last week when we went to Sunrise Mall, every preteen we talked to had seen them.
Sometimes friend's dad will take us out, something like that, or rent them. That's usually, I haven't seen too many though, Mom.
Sometimes they don't know because I watch them over at my friend's house. Even if usually their mom is some of the year.
Okay, this is good.
What I'm saying now, that there is loose in their towns and their communities people like me today whose dangerous impulses are being fueled day in and day out by violence in the media in its various forms, particularly sexualized violence.
Dell believes Ted Bundy. During the serial killer's final hours before his execution, he said, sex and violence in the media fueled his murderous frenzies. Experts call Bundy a psychopath and a trickster. But Waddell's Up, the American Family Association, is on a crusade against sexually violent movies.
A very dangerous part of these videos is that all of this hellish activity, this extreme violence and degradation, is shown to be some women especially enjoy, that it's acceptable to do these things. And many of them are training manuals, training films.
Now, I'm not saying that people, as a result of seeing these films, are going to go out and kill somebody. No research evidence to suggest that. I think the effect is a broader and perhaps more insidious effect. That is to say, people, normal people like you and I, becoming just less sensitive to victims of violence.
But in some cases, authorities now believe violent videos have inspired some teens to kill. A 15-year-old Massachusetts boy bludgeoned a classmate to death after watching the video Faces of Death. And in another case, a 19-year-old stabbed a female college student to death. Authorities found dozens of violent videos in his home. They also found a machete and goalies' masks, similar to the ones used by the killer in Friday the 13th.
Are you just going to put the clamps on any visual expression because it may affect 3 people out of 235 million people?
You have to sit down with your child and watch some of these films. Now, it's not pleasant, and I think you're going to be shocked as a parent at the content, but you're going to have to do it.
They're really gory, and they got a lot of blood and violence, and they're just really freaky.
In South, Don Hammond at Channel 3 reports.
Tomorrow night, we'll travel to Hollywood to get acquainted with the kind of people who make these kinds of movies.
Hollywood is the entertainment capital of the world, and it's also the place where graphically violent films are made for video distribution. In the words of one makeup artist, blood pays the rent. Tonight, as we conclude our special violent tapes, Channel 3's Don Hammond takes you to Hollywood and the people who make these films for a living.
All right, very, very quiet for a wild track of... Yeah, let's take blood off the lens. Here we go. Very still. Very still. And roll sound. Quiet. Speed.
Syrup and food coloring, red dye.
The beverage of the day is blood. Blood on the costumes, blood dripping from this head, and blood in the racks of your local video store. It's blood that many video viewing now developed a real thirst for.
When you see it gushing out and stuff, it looks sort of neat, you know, because you don't see it every day.
But that's part of all the excitement, is getting kind of grossed out.
But in many communities, the gross out has turned into a walkout. They don't want their kids watching graphically violent movies. Movies that do a booming business with the 11 to 15-year-old set. Movies they can't see in the theater because of an R rating. So what do the kids do? They rent them from the local video store.
We're the last man on the totem pole to get the product. I mean, if they want to go out and beat up the people, go to the directors and screenwriters and actors who actually get paid to make this type of entertainment for us. It's just entertainment, elite level.
Having a talking head dripping blood is fun because it's not real. To have a beautiful young girl held down on a table and have a headless, bodiless kiss her down her body, well, that's fun. It's fantasy. And I think with horror, I think that's the dividing line.
We caught up with Brian Usna on the set of his latest film, Bride of Reanimators. He's also Dolls from Beyond, and his big hit with the video renting set, Reanimators. The movies have a lot of blood and violence, but they're a far cry from slasher films that show murder depicted in the most gruesome fashion. Still, Usna's films are violently macabre.
We didn't make it with any rating in mind. We just made it with sort of personal sensibilities in mind. I personally control what my children see, and I think all parents have that obligation. I do think that I don't think that kids should be able to go and rent R-rated movies.
I was impaled on antlers. I was eaten by zombies. I danced nude on a tombstone. I have chainsawed people and chainsawed dueling matches. Had to fight demons. I've become a demon. I've stuck lipstick through my nipple and had it disappear. So that I've been shot. Just normal things like that.
Maybe normal for Linnea Quigley, who's made a name for herself by taking off her clothes and then being slashed, stabbed, and stomped to death. For most preteens and teenagers who feed on a steady diet of graphically violent videos.
And start biting. They shouldn't let kids, probably under 16, get those videos, because I think that in early life is when, you're formed about that sort of thing.
The sort of thing that every preteen and teenager we talked to at Sunrise Mall had seen.
Oh, in Return of the Living Dead, I did eat someone's brains.
Here's my head in the basket. We usually have fruit and vegetables in there drying. We've got a decapitated head. Need a hand? Okay. This is my friend Pasquale. It's just a good joke. People come in the house.
Chaz Ballin is an author and horror film critic. He's talked to hundreds of kids about the most gruesomely graphic movies.
If the world be a better place because there weren't horror films, there weren't explicit stalk and slash films, and the world would be at peace, well, then burn all the negatives of every horror film ever made, if that's going to be kind of a guarantee, but it isn't going.
We don't know the extent to which exposure to this kind of material results in actual violent behavior. What we do know is that exposure to this kind of material results in a more calloused person, a less sensitive person, a less sympathetic.
Since when have we decided that it's you know, that it's my responsibility for what, you know, your children see?
Don Hammond, report.